Here. It's good to see so many of you here, and a great pleasure to welcome an old friend and a previous speaker at this seminar series, Dr. Fraser, who is Emeritus Reader in Science and Religion at Cambridge University. Many of you will have had me recommend his excellent book on psychology and theology, which I think is now a standard text on the interdisciplinary engagement between psychology and theology. And it's on the topic of emotion, particularly complex emotions, that Fraser comes to speak to us this evening. So it's a great pleasure to welcome you back, Fraser, for this talk. I'll say a few more things at the end about the programme. Harry has sent most of you an email telling you about what's forthcoming this term, and if you're not already on the mailing list, I would encourage you to speak to Harry afterwards. He's the technical-looking fellow here with the camera who seems to know what he's doing with all of the things that confuse me. So thank you, Harry. And I'll hand over to Fraser for the evening. Thank you.
Thanks very much. It's a great pleasure to be here. It's always good to have some time with you, Chris. And I think over the last 20 years I've been to more conferences at St John's College than any other single venue. So this room has become quite familiar to me. So it's like coming to sort of second home, coming to the Wallis Room. So I want to talk about emotion, the varieties of emotion, and I was vaguely aping William James' famous Varieties of Religious Experience in choosing that title. And my first general point is that this category of emotion is a bit of a ragbag, and it includes all sorts of rather different things. And that's one of the problems, I think, in understanding what's going on with emotions, that what we put into this ragbag category is just too heterogeneous for us to make much headway with it. And there's history to this. I mean, the concept of emotion has not always been used in the way it is now. It's a creation of the mid-19th century. And I know something about the history of emotions through supervising a PhD on it by Thomas Dixon, I think the most able PhD student I've ever had, from whom I learned far more than he learned from me. But that's the way it ideally ought to go, I think, in graduate supervision. So my view of the history of emotion is one that Thomas Dixon set out in his very successful book about passions and emotions. That though emotion had been used in a fragmentary, unsystematic way for quite a way back, it was really in the early 19th century with the Scottish thinker Brown that the category of emotion as we now understand it started to be introduced and moved its way into the emerging discipline of psychology. So that by, anyway, 130 years ago, maybe a little bit more, it had become the standard concept in this area of the developing discipline of secularized psychology. But that was a new way of conceptualizing things. And Dixon's point is that there had been a rich discourse about these things before psychology got going as an independent secular discipline. It had been a discourse which had been predominantly found in religious writers of one kind or another, and it had been conceptually more differentiated than this concept of emotion. It had included passions, sentiments, affections, appetites, a more differentiated discourse. I think the difference between passions and affections is particularly interesting. Passions tend to sort of take people over in a way that reduces their capacity for self-regulation. Affections are rather the opposite. Affections are gentler, they're more cognitive, they're part of the machinery of self-regulation, actually enhance it. So lumping passions and affections together in this newish, as it was in the end of the 19th century, newish umbrella concept of emotions was really not very helpful. It was mixing too many different things together. And one of the conclusions that Thomas Dixon draws from all this, and I agree with him, is that because this umbrella concept of emotions doesn't really work, we're having to find ways now of subdividing the rather disparate things that we put into this category. Exactly how to subdivide it, I think there is not yet any very clear consensus about. But I think the most fruitful distinction is the one between basic and complex emotions. And I think that distinction, at least, is pretty secure. So that's a good place to start in beginning to subdivide what we want to say about different kinds of emotions. It's easy to make distinctions. You can always make distinctions, and some distinctions work better than others. And I have a nice memory of when I was an undergraduate in Oxford going to philosophy lectures, and at a very sparsely attended philosophy lecture at 9 o'clock in the morning with this elderly, rather shambolic philosophy lecturer saying at one point, "And now I'm going to make a distinction, and for all I know, it might be an important distinction." I think that was a sort of understated Oxford way of saying that he did actually think that the distinction he was going to make was an important one. But not all distinctions are. What do you look for in an important distinction? I think the key thing you look for is a distinction that goes across quite a number of different domains. It's easy to make a distinction in one domain, but unless it maps onto parallel distinctions in other domains, you may not have got onto anything really important. And I think the distinction between basic and complex emotions goes across 7 different domains, which is a lot. And I'll set this out for you briefly. And even if you have doubts about 1 or 2 of them, I'm still left with really quite a lot of differences between basic and complex emotions. I perhaps better give you some lists of emotions before we go into that. The most significant theorist in this area is a guy called Paul Ekman, explicitly building on one of the later books that Charles Darwin wrote about emotions and their expressions in the late 19th century. Ekman has a list of 6 basic emotions. There's a bit of controversy about 1 or 2 of them, but I think everyone would admit anger, disgust, fear, and sadness. Anger, disgust, fear, and sadness. He also adds in happiness, and I think it's quite interesting that there is just one positive emotion, and positive emotions seem to be a bit different from negative emotions. They're not just sort of positive rather than negative. They don't seem to have quite the same kind of biological basis, don't seem to be as intrusive. So I think happiness is a slightly odd one in the list, and he also has surprise in his list, which I think is even odder, and quite a number of people have doubted whether that ought to be in the list. But at least the first 4, anger, disgust, fear, sadness, they're the sort of prototype basic emotions. And complex emotions, most people would have jealousy, shame, guilt, pride, that kind of thing. Sometimes they've been conceptualized as self-conscious emotions. I think that's quite a useful label. Other people have talked about moral emotions, and that also largely maps onto the same set of emotions. Jonathan Haidt, for example, talks about moral emotions. Now, I think these 2 lists of emotion differ, as I say, in 7 ways, so let me go through that. Firstly, in terms of range of species, and I think it's true that basic emotions occur in a wide range of species. In all our hominid ancestors, you find the same basic emotions. Secondary emotions are more distinctively human, though I think you can never say that in an absolute way, because it seems to me that almost everything that is characteristic of humans has antecedents in other species, and language is the obvious example. Language is very characteristic of humans. We are the talking species, but chimps can learn a bit of language as well. So it's not, language is not unique to humans, but it is, I think, characteristic of humans. And in a similar kind of way, I want to say that secondary emotions are characteristic of humans, even though you can find some antecedents in other species. So that's the first difference, range of species you find them in. And then secondly, within humans, basic emotions are universal culturally. You find them in all cultures. Secondary emotions are a bit patchy. You seem to find them in most, but not all, and anthropologists are usually able to turn up some strange society somewhere in which you don't find any particular secondary emotion. And secondary emotions also seem to be a bit historically contingent as well, that social historians talk quite a bit about some periods being shame cultures, other periods being guilt cultures. We seem to move between these two. These are sort of relative emphases rather than one of those emotions being completely absent in some historical periods. But secondary emotions seem to be much more culturally and historically specific than basic emotions are, which you find everywhere. Thirdly, the expression of emotions. There is a standard facial expression for each basic emotion, a standard way of expressing fear, anger, disgust, sadness. And if I was more into PowerPoint than I am, I'd have brought some nice pictures of this for you, and you can find some of those pictures going back to Charles Darwin's 19th century book about the expression of emotions. And it's not surprising that other species display what seem to be the same emotions in the same way. So we've got some very standard basic facial expressions which for each of these emotions invariant across species and across cultures. The expression of secondary emotions is much more subtle. It quite often involves more varied aspects of body language rather than this very conspicuous facial expression. And there's more cultural variation in how secondary emotions are expressed. So really quite important differences in the expression of emotion. And fourthly, there are differences in the neural substrate. And I mean, my grasp of the structure of the brain is appallingly primitive, and I have to admit I haven't got much beyond carving it up into hemispheres and lobes. But that's enough for this purpose, I think. And the important fact is that the complex emotions are heavily dependent on our frontal lobes, which are much more developed in humans than they are in any other species. So that ties together with other things I've been saying. And if you get frontal lobe degeneration in neurological disorders, then that really interferes with people's secondary emotions. Basic emotions seem to be less dependent on the frontal lobes, more located in the temporal lobes. I'm just talking about the biological substrate. I'm not doing a strong reductionist pitch here. I'm just saying which bits of the brain are involved, and they seem to be different bits of the brain for basic and complex emotions. Then, fifth in my list, human development. Basic emotions develop earlier, usually in the first year of life. Secondary emotions develop in the second or even third year of life. So this is not surprising because human development often recapitulates evolutionary development. Secondary emotions seem to be a later evolutionary development. They also seem to be a later development in the lifespan of a human individual. 6, cognitive elaboration. That there is much more conceptualization going on in complex emotions. Basic emotions are quite reflex-like, and I think disgust is the most reflex-like of the basic emotions. If you see something that triggers a disgust reaction, it is just immediate and involuntary, and there seems to be very little cognitive mediation going on in that. It is very reflex-like. Whereas secondary emotions are much more dependent on what sense you're making of the situation, how you're interpreting your relationships with people around you, that kind of thing. There's much more cognitive interpretation going on with secondary emotions than with the more reflex-like basic emotions. And lastly, seventhly, complex emotions are much more important in social regulation and the relationship of sorry, I've lost where that sentence was going. Complex emotions are much more important in social regulation. Emotions like guilt and shame are crucially involved in identifying problems in relationships, in the repair of relationships. Basic emotions like disgust, fear are not involved in that kind of social regulation in the same way. So I think I've got quite a long list there of differences between basic and complex emotions, the range of species, how culturally universal in humans, how they're expressed, what the neural substrate is, when they develop in children, the amount of cognitive elaboration involved, and their role in social regulation. So I'm not saying, I think for all I know, this might be an important distinction. I'm pretty confident this is an important distinction, else you wouldn't find it going across quite so many domains as that. And perhaps the only caveat I'd want to have about this distinction is that I don't think it's an absolute one. And in a species like humans that have well-developed complex emotions, then the basic emotions sometimes take on a bit of complexity. So I think there's a bit of sort of seepage up this, over this boundary. I think basic emotions, at least some of them, can become rather complexified. But still, I think there is enough reason in what I've said so far to establish that this is an important distinction. So having laid out that distinction, I want to make 3 claims about it. One, and they're all about the importance of secondary complex emotions. One is that complex emotions are really important in mental health. Secondly, complex emotions are really important in religion. And thirdly, complex emotions are a useful resource in framing a theology of what it is to be human. So let me take you through those 3 claims, and that's what the rest of my talk is about. So firstly about complex emotions in mental health. You can have 2 kinds of problems with complex emotions. You can have not enough of them or too much of them. And there are some people who seem relatively lacking in complex emotions. Embarrassment, for example. Some people don't suffer much embarrassment. Ken Clarke, prominent Conservative politician, fairly recently retired from his last cabinet post, claimed that he had very little embarrassment, and when the time came when some member of the cabinet had to tell Mrs. Thatcher that she had to retire, Ken Clarke offered to do it because he said he didn't have embarrassment. This would be no problem to him. I think his colleagues were very happy to leave it to him and relieved that there was a colleague who had such a low, so little embarrassment that he was able to take on this task. But it's not entirely a good thing having very little embarrassment, and it tends to be correlated with delinquency. Probably a deficiency in various complex emotions tends to be correlated with delinquency, psychopathy, that kind of thing. So a lack of complex emotions is not entirely a good thing, though it can be useful in standing up to Mrs. Thatcher. But it's much more common, I think, with mental health problems to have an excess of complex emotions. And guilt and shame are quite important in anyone's list of complex emotions. And anyone who's worked in mental health services will know how important guilt and shame are. Not that those emotions are always a bad thing, and with guilt in particular, I think it's really useful and important to make a distinction between realistic and neurotic guilt, a distinction that goes back to Freud. Some guilt is realistic and appropriate. People feel guilty because they've done things that they really shouldn't have. They recognize that, so does everyone else, and the guilt is realistic. It's proportionate. It's contextual. There is other kinds of guilt, which is Freud called neurotic guilt, which is excessive, pervasive, disproportionate. People feel neurotic guilt about anything and everything, even when the objective observer would think there was no real basis for feeling guilty. So it's important to have this distinction in mind, and in talking about the role that complex emotions can contribute to mental health problems, I'm really talking about the excessive or neurotic extremities of this, rather than just having these emotions at all. And there are some significant features of how these complex emotions can work to maintain and ratchet up emotional disorders. And I think you see this most clearly in research on depression, but it probably applies in other places as well. One is about how long these emotions go on for. And it's probably one of the important distinctions between normal unhappiness and depressive disorder. It's entirely normal when something upsetting happens, some experience of loss or something like that, to feel unhappy. one of the crucial differences with depressive disorders is that feeling of happiness is not just a temporary response to an event. It just rolls on and on and on. So that's one of the crucial ways in which complex emotions can get out of hand. They can get very perseverative and ruminative. And I think another important way in which they can lock people into emotional disorders, and again you see this most clearly in depression, is that people become depressed about being depressed. So not just depressed about things that have happened to them, but depressed about the way they've reacted to these events through being depressed. And there are pointers in the research to that being a crucial factor that locks people into depression, makes it much more difficult to bounce back from in a normal, healthy way. So I think those are pointers towards the kind of ways in which complex emotions can get out of hand and entrench people in emotional disorders. And I think that's to do with their distinctive features, the cognitive elaboration, the social regulation functions that are characteristic of complex emotions. You don't get that in the same kind of way with basic emotions. If you see something disgusting, you react to it in this reflex kind of way with disgust, but it passes. You don't get locked into it in the way that people get locked into depression. So that's my first claim about complex emotions, that they're really important in mental health problems. And I now want to say something about how they're important in religious life as well. So I've been saying that complex emotions are important in relationships, repairing relationships when they've come under strain. And I think for many religious people, complex emotions are important in maintaining their relationship with God and keeping that in good repair. Quite a lot of religious life seems to be about that, about the role complex emotions can play in the relationship with God. So prayer is one of the arenas where that happens, I think. One of the standard features of prayer is confession, and the management of sin is an important aspect of what's going on with prayer. That people identify things that they have done which have set them against God's purposes, and have an opportunity to regret those things, to confess them, to receive forgiveness for them, and through doing that to repair the relationship with God that has gone awry through their sinfulness. So that's it seems to me that's one of the important ways in which complex emotions play a role in the religious task of maintaining a relationship with God. And I think it's an interesting question whether they do that in all religious people or just in some. And I suppose it depends how you conceptualize God and what sort of relationship people have with God. And we've inherited various different ways of conceptualizing the transcendent, and a lot of religious people conceptualize divinity in a very personal way and feel that they're relating to someone who is really rather like a human person, only in the sense bigger and better and gooder, wiser. There's also a tradition of thinking about the transcendent, about divinity in more impersonal ways, of kind of forces or energies for love and healing. And there seems to be a cultural shift going on, and I said something briefly about this when I was here a year ago talking about mindfulness. I think there's a cultural shift going on away from rather personal, or you might even say anthropomorphic, ways of conceptualizing divinity to more impersonal ways of thinking about divinity in terms of energy or forces. And it seems to me that this way of using complex emotions to repair the relationship with God works much better for people who are conceptualizing God in personal anthropomorphic ways than for people who are conceptualizing divinity in more abstract, impersonal ways. Now, if we want to drill down into this a little bit more, I think it's probably helpful to think specifically about shame and guilt. And I mentioned earlier on that there's quite a widespread idea seems to be in a very guilt-laden culture. And the religious traditions that stem from the Reformation, I believe, are very much influenced by that. The first English language prayer book, the first English language translations of the Bible come out of a guilt culture. And even if we modernize the language and kind of bring it, in a sense, up to date, I think a lot of the connotations of that guilt culture in which those things were first translated into the English language, those connotations stay with us even when the language is updated. We don't seem to be living in a guilt culture now. A lot of people have commented on this being more of a shame culture in which there is a great deal of narcissism. Now, I need to say something a bit more specific about what the contrast is between guilt and shame. And there are two main ideas around, and in my usual ironic way, I think there's some truth in both of them. One idea is that guilt focuses on behavior, on particular things that you've done wrong, whereas shame is more pervasive. You feel ashamed of the kind of person you are, not just the things you've done wrong. And there's also a public-private distinction, and this tends to be made more amongst social scientists rather than psychologists, that guilt is something private, whereas shame, being shamed, is something that happens in public in your relationships with other people and society. As I say, I think there's some truth in both of those ideas. I think in the West, as I was saying a moment ago, since the Reformation, we've got hold of a rather guilt-laden version of Christianity. And one of the cultural problems for Christianity at the moment is that, though that's the case, we're living in a culture which is not a guilt culture. So I think there's a kind of mismatch between this version of Christianity that's rather conceptualized in guilt-laden terms, and the lack of emphasis on guilt in our culture. And I think that's an aspect of the missionary situation that needs quite a lot of care and attention. And it's the kind of big issue about the flourishing of Christianity that seems to be completely missed in current plans for the future of the churches. I mean, as far as I can gather, the House of Bishops idea for how to improve the state of the Church of England seemed to largely revolve around having more and better trained clergy and managing resources better. They don't seem to be addressing the big issues about why people in our culture feel out of tune with the kind of Christianity that's being purveyed. I think we need to get down to those big issues, but I shouldn't get started on that too much at the moment. We can come back to that in discussion if we want to. So I think it's quite easy to see how guilt can play a role in religious life, and I've hinted at that already. It plays a role in the management of sin, the experience of sinfulness, in confessing that, receiving forgiveness and so forth, and plays a role in restoring a harmonious relationship with God. I think it's less clear what role shame plays or how that works in the religious life. We have religious rituals for dealing with guilt through sacramental confession. We don't have any corresponding rituals for dealing with the sense of shame, when people feel ashamed of the, not just of what they've done, but of the kind of people they are. We don't have much idea what sort of repair of the relationship with God is appropriate there. But I think it's going to have something to do with a deeper recognition of the love and acceptance of God, rather than just forgiveness for the things that you've done wrong. But it's something that needs a lot more development than it's received. Another way in which emotions, particularly complex emotions, work themselves out is through the pattern of attributions that they were associated with. It's been one of the very important discoveries about depression over the last, 20, 30 years, that there is a depressive pattern of attributions that is characteristic of depression and keeps people locked into depression. It's basically, whereas most people have a sort of rosy glow pattern of attributions, they attribute successes to themselves and failures to bad luck or something like that, which keeps your self-esteem in good repair. Depressed people tend to switch this round and to attribute failures to their own inability or incompetence or unworthiness or something like that. And if anything goes right, then they take that as a fluke and not confirming anything positive about themselves. So as I say, this pattern of attribution is both characteristic of depression and one of the key things that keeps people locked into it, because it accentuates the impact of negative experiences and always tends to discount positive experiences. I've got very interested in the role of religion on people's attributions, and I think that works in quite subtle ways. There's a fairly obvious initial point that religious people tend to attribute things to God. But people do that in a variety of different ways. Some people do that in a rather general way, attributing the beauty and the good things of creation to God, without getting too specific about it. Other people are much more discreet and episodic about it. When they're late for a meeting and the traffic lights go green just at the right time, some Christians would say, "Thank you, God." as though God has sort of fixed the traffic lights, I think is one of the interesting distinctions between Christians, whether they do that sort of very specific attributions or whether they do it in the more general way, a more general interpretation of providence. But somehow or other, most Christians are involved in religious attributions of some of the good things that happen in life. And there's another interesting question about whether that is an alternative to natural attributions or not. So, I mean, if the traffic lights go green for you, is that as well as or instead of the traffic light mechanisms that have been installed electronically. It seems to be a big mistake to see it as instead of. Then you start thinking of God as a cause in the natural world alongside other causes, and you get into a debate about which of the various causes operating in the natural world are responsible for this event. Is this something that was down through the mechanism in the traffic lights, or is this due to God? And that's a very stupid kind of either-or question, I think. So the sensible theological view, I think, has to be that it's both and, that you take religious attributions as being additional to, adding another layer of attributions on top of normal naturalistic attributions. But it does have an emotional impact on your naturalistic attributions. I think it makes you sit a little bit less light, sit a bit lighter on them. And the result of that emotion is that if you're doing some kind of high-level attribution to God alongside whatever naturalistic attributions you're making, you get less locked into the pattern of pride or shame than that you might otherwise get locked into. I mentioned the usual rosy glow pattern of attributing good things to yourself, and the depressive pattern of attributing the bad things to yourself. Both of those are unhelpful to us emotionally, I think, if we get too much locked into either of those mindsets, either a rosy glow or a depressive outlook. And I think if you're running providential attributions to God alongside your naturalistic attributions, then you're kind of liberated from some of the entrenchment into those naturalistic attributions. And I think emotionally that's probably quite helpful. I've been talking about attributions to God, but actually attributions, religious attributions are more diverse than that. And I've fairly recently completed a research study on religious attributions that illustrates that. So let me just tell you very briefly about that, but then I must get on. We were looking at it in a now defunct new religious movement that had massive correspondence about spiritual healing with over 130,000 people. Chris knows the society that I'm talking about. And the most research on religious attributions, I think, has used a completely hopeless methodology of giving people sort of vignettes and asking them, if this happened to you, how would you attribute it? And I think that gives you very noisy kind of data, because people can just sort of say the first thing that came into their head. But we had an opportunity of doing a study of religious attributions through looking at the correspondence in this enormous archive and looking at how people online in real time had attributed improvements in their health or a lack of improvement or even deterioration, and found that, not surprisingly, that religious attributions were used much more for the improvements. but also quite a diverse range of religious attributions, not just to God, but also to this religious society that had guided them into spiritual healing, into the healing water that was being used, and so on. Quite a wide range of religious attributions. So I need to move on. Let me just find where I'm going. So this is into my third claim, which is that complex emotions are quite important in the Christian theology of what it is to be human. And that may seem a surprising claim because the predominant tradition, theological tradition about what it is to be human has emphasized our rationality. That's what you find in classical theologians like Aquinas. And of course I've got some sympathy with that. I think it is a striking fact about humans that we have more advanced cognitive capacities than other hominids, and so I've got no argument with the idea that that's one of the distinctive things about human beings. But the important issue that this raises is whether emotions are somehow to be contrasted with rationality, or whether they're part of rationality. And that's a complex story, and it goes back to the work of Thomas Dixon that I mentioned earlier on. There's a tendency in the older theological literature that talks about passions to see passions as antagonistic to rationality, but that's not true of all of what we would now call emotions and affections, which are gentler, more cognitive aspects of emotion, play an important role in the religious life. And probably Jonathan Edwards is the theologian who has written most extensively about the religious affections. So that's an important part of the tradition, I think, of how what we would now call emotions can be intertwined with our rationality rather than be seen as an opposition to it. And it's also a feature of what I'm calling complex emotions, that they're intertwined with our rationality, whereas basic emotions, like disgust, are relatively independent of it. And there's been really quite an important sea change in how people see the relationship between cognition and emotion that seems to have happened at about the same time in both philosophy and psychology, and I think historically fairly independently, though it would be an interesting piece of research on intellectual history to track that back. But people seem to have woken up 20 or 30 years ago to the idea that emotions are part of our rationality rather than an obstacle to it. So, in saying that emotions are an important aspect, particularly complex emotions are an important aspect of what it is to be human, I'm not sort of pitting that against the mainline tradition which has emphasized rationality. I'm rather sort of wanting to integrate it and to expand our notion of what counts as rationality, so it includes at least our complex emotions. And last, I want to just say something briefly about the Adam and Eve story in Genesis 3, which has always intrigued me as a kind of text about what it is to be human. I take that chapter as quite a rich mythological reflection on human distinctiveness. And it's partly about cognitive capacities, I think, about the ability to make distinctions, most explicitly about the distinction between good and evil, also implicitly about the distinction between God and Adam and Eve, a distinction that seems to be a bit wobbly and not at all clear at the start of the story, but is rather painfully and embarrassingly clear to Adam and Eve by the end of the story. So I think that story is partly about emerging cognitive differentiation, but it's also about the emergence of secondary complex emotions, and particularly the sense of shame. And there's this interesting intertwining of the growing sense of differentiation between God and Adam and Eve, and the sense of shame in the presence of God, the sense of nakedness, the sort of rushing for something to cover up the nakedness. So that complex emotion of shame seems to be very much intertwined with the development of a more differentiated way of doing conceptualization. There's more I could say about that story of Adam and Eve, which has always intrigued me, but maybe we'll come back to that a little bit in questions. But I think probably this is a good point for me to draw this monologue to a close and me to invite some questions and conversation.